I loved medicine from the very beginning, going through medical school and eventually getting into clinical medicine. It was something I really loved, and I got paid for doing it. Yeah, I'd say I was a conscientious worker, and people respected that in me, and it enabled me to climb the ladder. There was no specific point, but I knew that I was going to have to retire at some stage in the future. Now remember, I loved my job. It was something that I really, really enjoyed, so giving it up was going to be a big deal. And it did worry me that when I retired, that the basis of my life would disappear and I'd fall into a heap. Of course, that didn't happen. In terms of how it affected me, surprisingly not at all. In fact, Helen, my wife, roughly at the time I retired, was diagnosed with a chronic neurological condition called PSP, which leads to a neurological decline. And of course, over the last 3 years, as I've retired, I've had to become more of a carer. Has that been a bad thing? Yes and no. We were planning to do other things. I'd imagine we would have travelled around Australia and maybe travel overseas together, which is something we didn't do, obviously, because of Helen's condition. But in many ways, there's been some positives there, and the positives are that the diagnosis was made around the time that we had the COVID pandemic in Australia. So we were sort of isolated at home together, and it enabled us to spend a lot more time together. Well, I think my identity hasn't changed pre and post retirement. I think in many ways there's been a bit of liberation in that I can do other things. And it's opened up a whole new world of literature, really, and reading not just literature but other interests along the way, music and other areas.
So the task this week was to create a video portrait of someone, interviewing them in terms of the prompt turning point. So one problematic aspect of my production was trying to fit all the videos into the 2-minute time constraint. I initially had around 10 minutes of footage, and all the information that my grandpa was telling me was really important to the narrative, so I found it difficult to omit certain information. I figured that this was because I had too many questions on my list of questions, and each of them had a really long and detailed, elaborate answer, which is good, but it did make the editing process quite difficult because I had to sacrifice a lot of information. Also, what was difficult was my grandpa speaks really slowly, so I had to speed up the videos and audio to fit into the 2-minute time constraint, and what this did was make edits really jumpy and mismatched. One aspect that I found quite successful in this task was the use of the B-roll footage. The raw interview without the B-roll footage, I was nervous because it felt quite dull and lacking emotion, but once I added the B-roll clips into the interview, I felt like the production was more actualized on what I was trying to achieve with a somber but upbeat tone. What was also quite successful about the B-roll footage was that it created a really good effect where the footage matched what my grandpa was talking about. For example, when he was talking about my grandma Helen, the photos and videos of Helen to accompany what he was talking about really created this feeling of intimacy and closeness that I think worked well. In terms of creative possibilities that I've discovered from this project, I think employing a 3-act structure, even in a documentary style, really helped to dramatize the piece, and I think in turn that works well with engaging the audience. I got this idea from Michael Rabbage's piece, Dramatic Development Time and Story Structure, wherein he discusses the 3-act structure as a cycle with a dramatic curve or dramatic arc, which is something that I found particularly relevant in the turning point prompt. One thing that I learned in this project that will definitely be relevant as a media practitioner is how important the placement of cuts in editing is. I already sort of knew this, but the way that you should not really notice a cut if it's strategically placed or timed is something that I really struggled with in this production. I found that it often does make it look quite messy or uncomfortable if it's placed messy or just not subtle enough. Some ways that I tried to create a smooth cut is by editing the cuts in accordance with how my grandpa spoke, and so that was things like his pace, his tone, and the actual content of what he was saying. Editing, and more specifically the cuts between the frames, is probably arguably one of the most important aspects of media production. It does serve to set the overall tone and can alternatively mess everything up.